Hey, Vinyl community. Hope you all are doing well. Today, I am going to do an episode which is a little different than the typical content that I feature on my channel, in that I'm talking about books. I don't usually show off the books that I have in my collection, but today I did want to talk about 5 of the most depressing biographies that I have in my collection, the most tragic, if you will, biographies that I have. Now, I love reading biographies more than any other genre of book. I've got a lot of music biographies, a couple non-musical biographies, but for the most part, my favorite book to read are books about musicians, biographies about artists and bands and things like that. So what I'm going to be showing today are 5 books that I have that are maybe the most tragic biographies that I have in my collection. Definitely the most depressing to read, just because the lives of these individuals were very troubled and definitely had a lot of issues and things going on. So the first one I'm going to show is Moon. This is the biography, obviously, of Keith Moon, the life and death of a rock legend. Now, I'm a huge Who fan, love the Who, and it's interesting reading about Keith Moon. This is a very extensive biography on Keith Moon. But Keith Moon, as great as a drummer he was, unfortunately, for a lot of his life, it was overshadowed by substance use and Keith trying to be a clown and doing some really outrageous things. And don't get me wrong, these make for very interesting, entertaining reads in this book, but there's this undercurrent of tragedy going along because he was an alcoholic, and very unfortunately, his alcoholism affected negatively a lot of the relationships that he had in his life. His marriage ended up breaking up because of his substance use. His musicianship as a drummer deteriorated because of his alcoholism. He was very abusive to the women in his life. Obviously, he was very self-destructive. As towards the end of his life, he started to become very unhealthy. He got overweight. And yet his alcohol use continued unabated. In fact, it was encouraged because people thought, oh, that's that crazy Keith Moon, and isn't he so outrageous, and isn't he so funny? And so a lot of people, I think, enabled Keith Moon just because Keith Moon was at his best as far as his partying friends were concerned when he was blitzed out of his mind. But one of the most tragic incidents that happened was in 1969. I believe it was right around New Year's. But Keith and his driver, I don't remember his name, but they had gone to a pub, and there were some skinheads at the pub, and they started making trouble with Keith and his friend, who was also his driver. And they went to go leave the club, and they were being followed by these skinheads. And Keith very quickly got into the car, and Neil Boland was his name. Now, it just came to me, his driver's name was Neil Boland, but they were really good friends. So Keith drove away very panicked, very quickly, very drunk, and did not notice that Neil Boland had been in front of the car, had driven over Neil Boland and actually dragged him several yards. And Neil passed away very tragically. And that haunted Keith the rest of his life. He felt terrible about that. That's one of the reasons why I think his drinking kind of accelerated. But he was actually trying to kick alcohol near the end of his life, and he actually overdosed on the medication that was supposed to be weaning him off of alcohol, and that's how he passed away. But just not a happy life. He was not happy. He was very uncomfortable in his own skin, felt the only time that he could be himself was when he had a drink or 20. So just a real tragic story. He was such a talent, such a great, fantastic drummer, and yet his life was very tumultuous, to say the least. Next biography, this is Kurt Cobain, Heavier Than Heaven, and this was written by Charles Cross. Obviously, Kurt Cobain's life, another talented artist, but full of tragedy. In this instance, the substance of choice was heroin, and again, it ruined a lot of the relationships in his life. A lot of the reasons for using heroin had to do with his upbringing, his childhood. His parents divorced when he was 7 or 8, when he was real young, and just had a very difficult time adjusting to that. And living with either of his parents was very, rocky, to say the least. Didn't get along with his parents, was very rebellious, so he's kind of bounced back and forth between each of his parents, and then was homeless for a while, and stardom came so quickly for him, he was not equipped to handle it, and just struggled with heroin use once Nirvana became famous. And obviously it accelerated, tried to kick it, thought when he had his daughter that was going to make a difference, but he was right back on heroin, and with tragic consequences. But another hugely talented artist, but very unfortunately part of the same club that Keith Moon was, the 26 Club. So, or is it 27 Club? The 27 Club. Yeah. But anyway, very, very unfortunate. Next biography, this is called Dream Brother, and this is kind of a dual biography. This is Jeff Buckley, and this is his father, Tim Buckley. And if you know anything about the artist Jeff Buckley, he was a great singer-songwriter in the early 90s. 94, he released what was his greatest album, one of the greatest albums of the 90s, Grace. His father was actually a folk singer-songwriter in the late 60s, early 70s. In many ways in the early 70s, very avant-garde and experimental, kind of in the same way, and Ornette Coleman was a bit experimental. Definitely alienated the audience that Tim Buckley had established with his kind of coffee house singer-songwriter roots in the late 60s, and in the early 70s decided he wanted to expand his sound, started getting into a lot of experimental type music, and was also very heavily a drug addict, and it cost him his life. Tried to kick it throughout the course of his later years and was unsuccessful. And then you have his son, Jeff Buckley, who grew up not really knowing his father because his father, Tim, was off trying to make music and have a career, and was divorced from Jeff's mom, Mary Guibert, who is now kind of in charge of Jeff Buckley's estate and his music. But nonetheless, Jeff Buckley, while he was not a drug user, he died very tragically. He drowned actually while he was in the middle of recording his second album. And just a sad story, but it parallels their lives, how they were both struggling musicians, trying to make a career, the relationships that they had, and how Jeff was always haunted by his father and his father's legacy. And just the pain of never knowing his father and growing up to be a musician like his father, trying not to repeat the same mistakes that his father made. So makes for very interesting reading, but it is definitely a very sad story, very sad and tragic story for both the Buckleys, but still an interesting read. Next book, this is Marvin Gaye, The Life and Death of Marvin Gaye by Steve Turner. Talk about tragic figures and gifted musicians. Marvin Gaye, one of the most gifted singers of all time, a soul icon, Motown icon, but very, very troubled. His upbringing was very abusive and sad. His dad actually was a minister, but very strict in terms of the music that he would allow Marvin to perform. There really was not supposed to be any secular music in the family. It was all supposed to be gospel. And Marvin wanted to break away from that, but was also seeking his father's approval and started singing more of that secular music. His father actually, in addition to being very abusive, was a cross-dresser, and that created a lot of issues for Marvin. He had a lot of substance use throughout the course of his life. He tragically lost the love of his life, Tammy Terrell, who died very early in her life, very tragically from, I believe it was a brain aneurysm. And that was a loss that he never got over, and subsequently got into a lot of drug use, created his masterpiece, What's Going On, got very much involved. His music got very political, but then as he got more into drugs, his music started to suffer a bit. And definitely his relationship suffered. He became very abusive to the women in his life. And it's very unfortunate because near the end of his life, due largely in part to the amount of drugs he was taking, not a nice man, not a good man at all. There's many people that he ripped off, many people that he treated very terribly, not just the women in his life, but business relationships, family members, and his life ended very sadly. His father actually shot and killed him. And some people say that it was an act of suicide on the part of Marvin. He knew his dad had a gun, and so he deliberately provoked his dad. There's just a lot of questions surrounding that incident and what happened. His dad did end up going to jail for a bit. But then I think he was released because it was considered self-defense, because Marvin was very agitated. They had an altercation. And so I think the case was eventually made that the dad was defending himself. But nonetheless, didn't have to end this way. It's very sad. One of the most talented artists, not just of the Motown era, but of the 60s and 70s. Lots of great music, but very, as the title suggests, very, very troubled man. And then the creme de la creme, probably the most, tragic, depressing, but this guy's life was such a train wreck. And I'm talking about Chet Baker. And you don't even have to actually start reading this book to know what a hot mess Chet Baker's life was, because on the slipcover for this book, it illustrates it very, very effectively. So this is Chet Baker at his most handsome in the 1950s, when he was a very popular jazz trumpeter. Women were all over him. He was very popular, not only for his music, but for his looks. And his life, because of drug use, spiraled downward. And by the 1980s, this is what Chet Baker looked like. This is before drugs. This is after basically 30 years of drug use. So, yeah. And it only gets worse when you open up and start reading it, because for most of his life, he was a very raging heroin addict and not a good guy. Same Marvin Gaye, not a good guy. He pissed on so many relationships, was abusive to so many women, stole to get his drugs, was kicked out of so many different countries. Brilliant, talented musician, but he squandered it all away for the needle and heroin. And it is very tragic. And you feel sorrier for the people who crossed his path, who loved him, who were in relationships with him, because he just treated them like dirt. And it did not end well for anybody who knew Chet Baker. But very interesting story. One of the most interesting jazz biographies I've ever read. But interesting figure, just not a very good guy. So anyway, those are books that I wanted to share. Didn't mean for this video to go on for so long, but if you are into biographies and you want a very interesting read, you like your tragedies as well as your uplifting, positive bios, I would recommend checking these ones out. All right, everybody, take care.